Hello, this is David Cotter with Integrity Capital. We're going to be discussing how to value a building. So the first component is how do appraisers actually value buildings? And there's really three approaches that they take, typically speaking. The first one is the sales approach. And the sales approach is fairly simple. They're essentially going to take the building square footage, they're going to take the location, they're going to look at when it was built, if there was any renovations or upgrades to the building. They're going to look at the inside to see how it's built out and what the applicable use might be for the building, if it's office or retail, industrial, and the like. And at that point, they are going to go out to the market and look for sales comps or comparables for this like kind property. So they're going to look at properties that have sold within a regular geographic region, perhaps a couple of miles. Could sometimes go further than that. They're going to look at like kind square footage, like kind look, like kind use of the building. So if it's industrial, they're going to look for industrial. If it's office, they're going to look for office. If it is retail, they're going to look for retail. So they're going to do as much as they can to look for things that have sold within the last 6 months or so, give or take a few months, to see how they line up to the subject building, which would be your building. And then they're going to line all those up and they'll make adjustments up or down if the building that they are comparing is inferior in terms of how it's been maintained or superior maybe on the location. And they'll take all of those adjustments and then come up with a final sales approach valuation. The second approach is what's called an income approach. And the income approach, generally speaking, for an income property versus a owner-occupied property, will be what the appraiser will put more emphasis on in their valuation. So that would be if somebody's going to rent the building out to tenants or a tenant with a lease and then receive income, then they're going to focus on the income approach. Let me also add on the sales approach, that can be for investment or owner-occupied, both. And they will do all three approaches for an appraisal as well, typically speaking, but they'll emphasize one over the other. As I had mentioned, on an owner-occupied, they're going to put more emphasis on the sales approach than the income approach, because that will be the use, is for owner-occupied. The income approach, the way that they're going to look at this is they're first going to identify rents. What are the rents that the building is actually receiving at present, if there are any? And then what are the rents that are going on around the market? Are they in line, or is one higher versus the other? Is one lower versus the other? And they're going to make adjustments again based upon how the building is conditioned, location, size, square footage, all the other factors that go into play, the type of tenant. The next thing they're going to do is they're going to look at the vacancy factor in the market. If they take all those like-kind properties and they take all of the occupancy versus the vacancy, what is the average vacancy rate for that sub-market? And then they're going to use that as their number for the building. They'll then take the expenses, the operating expenses. It could be taxes, it could be leasing, management fees, commissions, all of the operating expenses it takes to run an income property. They're going to look at that and compare that to, again, like-kind properties. They'll put that number in, and then they're going to come up with a net operating income. So this is what hits the bottom line prior to paying any debt service or reserves. So they're going to take the rents minus the vacancy minus the expenses, and they're going to come up with a net operating income on an annualized basis for the property. What they'll then do is look at the reserves. Now, what are reserves? What these are is, typically speaking, you're going to have turnover. So a tenant might leave, and now you're going to have to do tenant improvements for the location. You're going to have to spend money on a leasing agent to fill the property up and spend commissions on them. So they'll typically do what's called TILC reserves, or tenant improvements and leasing commissions for the site. And then they'll use that on a average basis. They'll usually take 10 to 15, maybe 20 cents a foot of the subject site and use that as a number. What they'll do is they'll take the net operating income, deduct out the reserves number, and then they'll come up with a net cash flow, which is the number that they'll use as their final analysis prior to actually dividing it by a cap rate. So they're going to take this net cash flow, which is, again, all the monies that hit the bottom line prior to making debt payments, and then they're going to value it based upon what is called a capitalization rate. And you say, well, what is a capitalization rate? And it's a little tricky. In sum, it's really the what the market is willing to pay as a return based upon the cash flow for this location. So, for example, if I was buying a Walgreens on a corner in Metro Phoenix or downtown New York, that is going to be very different cap rate than if I'm in the middle of Casa Grande, in the middle of nowhere, and I'm buying a building where there's Joe's Crab Shack. Meaning that I am willing to take lower of a return on my money for a Walgreens in the middle of Metro Phoenix or downtown New York versus a Joe's Crab Shack in Casa Grande. I need to get a higher return for my money that I put in there because there's more risk. It's lower risk if I have a Walgreens there because chances are I'll be able to fill that tenant up, and chances are they're going to stay. So that cap rate will be based upon location, it will be based on the type of tenant, it will be based on the condition of the property. All those variables come into play, and they're going to look at, again, like-kind properties and what they've sold for, and take an average cap rate based upon adjustments and divide that by the net cash flow to come up with the income approach. So again, you might have $100,000, you divide it by a capitalization rate of 7, and then that is how you come up with your number of 700,000 is what the building is worth. The final approach is the cost approach. And you say, what is this? The cost approach is just what it sounds like. What would it cost in order to rebuild this whole building in today's dollars based upon the same square footage, whatever the new permitting requirements are for the location and the subject site. So the cost approach is, again, always on the lower bottom of the totem pole versus sales and income approach. They really don't take too much emphasis on the cost approach, although they will include it, but there's not as much as emphasis because it's a high probability that it's not going to burn down or break down, and chances are it's going to be very different to rebuild a building than it is to sell it or to have it as an income building. So those are the three approaches on how you actually value a building. And so the question now is, what do you do about this? Because you're trying to identify if this building makes sense, if it's going to value the way that you need to, if you're either buying it or refinancing it, to make sure that you don't run into an issue on your financing. So the first thing is you need to identify, if it's a sale, what is the amount that they're asking for? We need to know that. The second thing you need to do is take pictures of the property inside and out. So you have a really good idea of what this looks like, because you're going to be giving this information to an appraiser or a commercial broker. The third thing you'll do is to get the square footage of the building. You can obviously get that off of a flyer. You can go onto the county assessor site, type in the address. You might be able to ask around. Many ways that you can identify to get the square footage of the building. The fourth thing is you're gonna look up, maybe online on Google, local commercial brokers. It might be a CBRE or NAI Horizon, but look to see commercial brokers in your geographic area, to ask them, to call them up and say, you know, I'm looking at buying the building, or we're trying to refinance. Do you mind giving me an opinion, just an idea of what this thing would sell for today, if you were listing it? The other thing you might want to do is type in local commercial appraisers in Google, and ask them their opinion, because again, that's what they do for a living. And the idea behind this is to really position yourself so that you are proceeding in a proactive fashion as opposed to reactive and going through all the process of financing only to find out at the very end that it's not going to appraise, which becomes a hindrance to you in your pursuit of getting financing. So again, this is Integrity Capital, David Cotter, on how to value a building and how to prepare yourself on approaching it as well. Have a great day.